I'll push her out a high window next time, he told his son. That's always a good thing.
And then the cat's getting nerdy a little bit.
Let's make some bright little clouds.
This is how to be a sociopath, right?
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Sheehan is Dead Comic Book Hour.
It's a mood.
Wait a minute. Ready? Let's get a little crazy. Get our 2-inch brush. Have you ever met Rob Liefeld? You guys! I got a Blue Yeti mic. It's like everybody has a Rob Liefeld story. And it's not from my son because I don't have one. But Robbie Liefeld inspired me to get a Blue Yeti mic. And I saved $10 using my Best Buy credit card.
Yeah, you know, I'm super excited about the new cable omnibus. Because you know what it's going to be?
Just cable.
It's cable, and it's going to be 800 pages of just issue 1.
It's a win.
It's winning. Yes.
No, it's a bobblehead. And then he says, like, look at those clouds. Let's see if you can hear it.
Do it again. He's shy.
Yeah, he's like, let's make some bright little clouds. Let's get a little crazy. Get our 2-inch brush.
Where did you find that?
At work, my coworker, the one who makes really good life choices.
Excellent life choices.
Oh, super. That's why you come into work with a black eye. But I digress. She had found this on an old coworker's case, and I jumped up and I'm like, oh my God, Bob Ross. Apparently, well, I told her, I said, oh, you were busy listening to AC/DC. She's like, probably was. It's like peanut butter and French fries. It's like Bob Ross and Darth Vader's melted helmet. I feel like I'm talking into a black hole.
For those of you who don't know, yes, there's a special limited edition Rob Liefeld Blue Yeti.
I'm the last person in the universe who's never met Rob.
But the weird thing about Rob Liefeld is that everything is 1995. They killed Superman. Remember?
Yeah, I know.
So they had to do a gimmick. Gimmick.
Turbulent times. Hey there.
But yeah.
What a cool job.
Super.
Oh, and your job's not cool?
Not as cool as that one, honestly.
Well, Drea, first off, I'm super geeked right now. I'm so very, very grateful that you made time to speak with us.
That's so very kind. Well, thank you so much for thinking of having me on the show. And of course, for noticing my work in those bonus features. And as you know, those date back 10 years, maybe 11 years now.
That's where I first found you. Yeah. On the Necessary Evil one.
Yeah.
Did you have a plan? Like how did you come to this place in practicing in the way that you do?
I grew up reading comics. I think the first, I started with comic strips, actually. I would grab the newspaper. My dad and I would read comic strips, and then I started to buy comic strip books. So I started to collect like comic strips when I was really little. And then I discovered comic books, and I would start to go to the comic book shop. This was now elementary school. And then the animated series came out in 92. And that show introduced me to the world of Batman. And that's when I really just found myself immersed in the characters, the storylines, the plots, all of the fantastic, the imagination really of Paul Dini, Bruce Timm, and that team. They really created a psychologically deep landscape for us. And imagine, we're a bunch of kids for the most part. I know adults also watched it, but I was in a cohort of kids that grew up with this Batman. And so that really kind of formed my identity in many ways, just to kind of connect to these fictional characters. And then for a long time, I kind of tried to put it aside because especially in like the early 2000s, liking comic books and comic book characters as an adult was really not well accepted. If you're a woman, it's definitely not widely accepted. And so I kind of minimized that part of my identity, and then went into psychology, and that brought me right back to the stories that created and formed my imaginative mind, my own sense of self. And so that really led me to kind of figure out, how do I dovetail these interests and passions? How do I really like think about not so much like this is fun, I enjoy this, but like this is a career.
I thought it was interesting. You had been on a podcast with an associate who's also in your practice area. And he was kind of like, well, you should just take it to school, teach it in school and like do the more kind of conventional approach to it. And you were just kind of like, well, I don't really want to. So
Right.
I thought that was interesting.
It's not the first time that someone will tell me, look, you're a psychologist, you love this thing, like, why don't you create a curriculum or really formalize and manualize, standardize this work? And there's nothing wrong with that idea. There's nothing wrong with kind of institutionalizing this.
Mm-hmm.
But I found it to be, you're right. I did have this reaction to that very fair and very complimentary question that I got about this work that I do. And that reaction that I had is, that kind of sounds, for one, it sounds like not something that I would do. I wouldn't package this and then sell this, or package it and distribute it in a way that just like creates more barriers and complicates things. Mm. We know what we have. We have a podcast that's available to everybody in the world, free. We have, or I have articles and essays, again, available to the world for free, without the costs and burdens that I think the field of psychology sometimes creates and perpetuates a hierarchy around who can know this and who can't. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm glad you point that out, because frankly, I care about the science. I went through a very rigorous PhD program. I completed my internship. I completed hours. I got licensed. For anyone in the field of psychology, there's just a lot of necessary hurdles and requirements to become a practitioner and also to become a scientist. And it was important to me to cover that, to just really to really actualize what I found to be important, and then to take that and just make it available to the communities that I think it could help. And I'm not saying I won't have a book or write a few chapters here and there, because I've done that, but I just prefer to, I almost want to say, radicalize the field a little bit, mm-hmm. in a way that I think can reach a lot of people, but also can be a lot of fun.
Let me just throw this in there too. Scott and I are both very much into the psychology of people. We both pay a lot of attention. No, we
what does that mean?
I bust his chops about being a social engineer.
I guess the point I'm making is your words are appreciated more than you might get from a regular appearance. Being familiar with your work, I was like, oh wow, Drea has a podcast. That's really neat. I'll check it out. But then I started to think to myself, well, how can you break down a Batman cartoon, or like, what's the psychology other than what I watched? And then listening to it, it was like one door after another just opened. And I was like, wow. And it just really expanded my mind and my thoughts about this media that, like you said, I've grown up in and found some identity with and just loved and found security and my own comforts through many things.
That means a lot. And I think too, we know we have a very diverse audience. I'll hear from very young people who'll say they're in school, they're in high school, elementary school, and they listen to the show. They're interested in getting involved in the field. Or I'll hear from very accomplished practitioners and psychologists and folks who are listening to gain insights, or just because they're interested in some of the topics, and that's very valuable. And I've just noticed that there's different elements to our listeners. Some listen with more of an educational approach, and some listen for the entertainment. We're really trying to balance that, right? I mean, you host a show. It's that tight balance between wanting to put something in the space that's unique to you and your show and your brand. And then also there's an element of entertainment. There's an element of wanting that to land well. And look, as you know, psychology has some really dark themes. There's themes around heavy diagnoses. There's themes around loss, injury, death, suicide. We deal, especially with Batman, we deal with a lot of harm, and it's grounded. And so I think that the work that we do, and I definitely have to give credit to my co-host, Brian Ward, is that we have to bring levity. We have to bring something relatable. We have to bring a style of communication that translates the science into something that a lot of people just are interested in some way. So, Brian, it's really awesome that you are connecting to the material in a very sort of personal way for you.
Indeed. Well said. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And Brian, your husband, Brian Ward, he's the gist I get. He's kind of like the pot stirrer a bit.
Oh,
And
yeah.
then you're the centered and like just here, and then he's kind of like this, which I very much relate to as well. So I find the dynamic. I mean, obviously you guys are married for a reason. You could tell. So that
I really enjoyed the 3-minute dissertation on why episode 4 is not episode 4. It's Star Wars. Come on, let's get this straight.
Yeah, we can get into some heated debates, especially around fandoms that we both care about. And we one of the things that's fun. So for folks not familiar with the Arkham Sessions podcast, we started almost 10 years ago with
It's
Batman.
been that long?
I think it's been 10 years. We started with Batman, the animated series.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we've ever talked about this on the show, but Brian, you'll probably understand this connection. About 10, 12 years ago, that was the first time I worked with Warner Brothers. They had me on the documentary film Necessary Evil Supervillains of DC.
Pick that up.
It's so good. And
really
something that I appreciate is that it's one of the very first documentaries that it dissects and sort of explores comic book characters in a very mainstream way. Now we see a handful of these come out every couple of years, right? These like documentaries about Comic-Cons and cosplay and comic book heroes. This was one of the very first of those documentaries, and it really gave just a lot of insight to comic book superheroes. And when I finished, actually, when it came out, my pre-husband, pre-co-host, then boyfriend said, "You keep talking about the animated series. Like each time that your commentary comes up, all your examples are about the animated series. And wouldn't it be a great idea to just start a podcast?" And my reaction was, no one cares about what I have to say about the animated series. No one's going to listen to that. But that's how we started. And it caught on, and we spent a few years covering the whole animated series. And we moved on to other IPs and other storylines since then. But that's why it's called the Arkham Sessions.
Right. Well, I'll show you how much I pay attention and how much I loved it. You're like, I think the first example you gave was about Big Bad Harv on the Necessary Villains. And then you were so into it when you talked about Mr. Freeze, and you were like, because he's saying, look, if you leave me alone, I won't harm you. And I was like, wow, like I remember those two specific instances. So
Mr. Freeze is it's just tragic.
It's incredibly tragic. And I really give a lot of credit to the writers of the animated series, and of course Paul Dini and the team there that gave more dimension. I mean, I think when it comes to comics, for people that don't read comics, I think that they may not realize that this isn't new. These very sometimes dark, complicated, psychologically rich stories, this is the way that young people especially have learned about very serious topics, psychology, sociopolitical issues, classism, issues around relationships, loss, genocide. There's just so many very there's just a wide landscape, right, that comics has given us. And I think that the three of us understand this, but the bigger mainstream audience, if you will, maybe the folks that see the MCU or this new stuff coming out of DC, which maybe we can talk about, I think their reaction is like, well, this is just like people hitting each other. It's just superficial. They may not understand that the history of comics is significantly impactful. And for many of us now as adults, we have a repertoire around our psychology that found origins in those stories. And I think X-Men impacted so many people in the 80s and 90s who are now like, framing their values around those very principles, those stories.
I'll tell you, one of the things that I've come to appreciate as I've gotten older is when it comes to Batman is the heavy darkness that he could use to, become self-destructive. He transposes that energy, that spirit, to something good, or for a good purpose, also to where that also weighs him down, to where Batman's not perfect and he makes mistakes. Like in the Hush, remember in Hush, Drea, when he he almost killed the Joker in the alley. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Right. So he can take it too far, but then he pulled back. And I've come to appreciate, as I've gotten older, as an adult, as a man, is we all have what is it, that is this the right term, the shadow side or dark side or whatnot. And growing up, I always thought of myself as a good guy. Hey, I'm like Superman, I'm like Batman, I'm a good guy. But as I've gotten older, there's a sharp balance between being a bad guy, which we're all capable of, being a villain, and the times when I've caught myself through my growing up, I was a villain in that instance. You know what I mean? And being mindful of the fact that I can slip off that cliff easily. So
You're right.
Are you actually a villain though? I mean, right? I mean, would you go so far? You're not a villain per se. You maybe just responded.
But I'm highly capable of it, despite thinking of myself as like, I'm Superman, I'm good and wholesome, but it's like I'm not. And I appreciate that about Batman. There's that same balance. What do you think?
I think that we might have to define what we all mean by villain, but I'm understanding what you're saying as it relates to the idea that we're not all good, we're not all bad. And Batman's story gives us permission to explore the parts of ourselves that are impulsive, that are negative, that are self-destructive, that are injurious to other people. And we might say like, well, I'm not a violent person. I don't hurt other people. And I remind us all that we have harmful thoughts, we have harmful impulses, we have ideas and impressions of other people. It's human to want to lash out. It's human to feel misunderstood, and that you want to externalize those negative experiences. And it's everybody's prerogative to figure out, how do I create in myself the characterological makeup to not harm other people, but to find a way to accept those parts of me that are destructive to the self and to others. And, that's therapy, by the way. That's, in my mind, what we do in the therapeutic relationship, but you can also do that more informally with your own work around preserving your sense of self. And so, yeah, I mean, while I'd say there's so many characters that I've written about Andor, I've written about Shuri from Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. I've written about Nick Cage from the last movie he was in. I write essays about all sorts of different characters, but Batman is, I think for me, the figure that continues to show us those vulnerable parts of themselves or himself, in order for us to relate to the heroism, but also to the the necessity of growth and development. No one is perfect. Even Superman has flaws, right? And I think that Batman's story is just continuously available for us around those issues.
I also feel like Batman taught me I don't have to be a victim, that no matter what odds I'm against, be they physical or mental, whatever they may be, I don't have to be a victim, that I can be like Batman and use that, instead of being afraid, I can take that energy and say, I'm going to confront this. I find a lot of empowerment consciously now, but I guess it was subconsciously then. You said you like complex stories. You've read Watchmen, I take it, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Have you read Doomsday Clock?
No, that came out
In
a few years ago, right?
Yeah. The hardcover came out about 3 years ago, and the absolute just came out toward the end of the year. That like picks up. Remember when DC did Rebirth and Dr. Manhattan was like the big bad?
Yeah.
So this is the confrontation, and it's 12 issues, and it's really complex. It's beautifully drawn. Jeff Johns writes the whole story. We're actually having the colorist Brad Anderson on. We're having him on next week just to pick his brain and whatnot. It's a beautiful story, and there's a lot of texture, and it's very grim and grimy. The book starts out with the fallout from Ozymandias's lie, where the people find out, and then it brings it into like our DC universe from there. It's really good. Like, I even gave it to Scott. I'm like, here, I know you don't know too much about this. This is the basic premise. This is what happened. Go. And Scott was like, whoa. So
yeah, I enjoyed it. It was good.
Highly recommend it. Doomsday Clock.
Okay, I'll put it on the list. Yes, Identity Crisis is known to be controversial because it tackled really serious topics. I enjoyed that trade because of its closeness to trauma. Mm-hmm. So it's a book, now that you've read it, Scott, it's a book that tells us a little bit about the aftermath of trauma. It's not just this thing happened 10, 12 years ago, or for Batman, this thing happened when I was a kid. This is happening now, and what is the impact of these traumatic events? That splash page. So the author's Brad Meltzer. I'm blanking on the artist, but that splash page, yes, it's that page with Batman cradling Tim Drake.
Robin, yeah.
And Tim Drake has just lost his father.
And the look in his eyes, like, yeah.
He's terrified. He's in horror. He's just discovered the body of his father. And there's this tenderness, something we don't see in Batman a lot, but even just that image with very few words gives us the compassion and tenderness, and the idea of almost a space for grief that we don't often see with superheroes. We don't really get the aftermath, the impact, the grief. This is really kind of slowing down a little bit and capturing that. And I remember reading that book and just like tears filling my eyes, just seeing how much emotion is just in that one page. Yeah. And I think for me, what it taught me is that Batman is doing some reparative work with his mentorship with Tim Drake. And here's yet another event that's going to require Batman, I guess here, Bruce Wayne, not just to do the reparative work for himself, but also to now care for this young kid who's just lost his father. And that's just like, 1/16 of the story. There's so many other things that happen in this story. It's really fantastic. I think it's gritty, and it also is very radical. And I think people had strong reactions to it, but I do recommend that book. Yeah. So I got to read it all in one book. I can't imagine getting the single issues and waiting for the next one.
Right. That's what I did. So that's what brought me back into comics, because I, had an in and out love affair, from my teens into my early 20s. And then reading that, I was like, wow, this is so different. This is so mature and so grounded. And I remember picking them up piece by piece and just being absolutely blown away by that.
You know what? I might have, because I'm actually tying it to when I first started to go to Comic-Con in San
Mhm.
Diego, and I started to go to Comic-Con in 2009, and I'm pretty sure I had just like read it the year before. And so that's kind of how I'm anchoring it. And I would actually, when I talked on panels, I've been attending Comic-Con and speaking on panels for 10 years, for about 10 years. I'm just going to say that number for each thing. And that's one of the examples I would give when people would say, you know, talk about like, how is psychology in comics? How does psychology come up in comics, especially as it relates to mental health, well-being, interpersonal conflict, trauma? And I bring up identity crisis as one of the examples where we could see both in narrative as well as in the sequential art, the depiction, although difficult to be exposed to, the depiction of these really serious topics.
There's always cleanup. So it's always when you're reading a comic or watching a movie, are you able to turn it off? Like your analysis.
No.
I have that on my notes too. I was wondering about that.
I was like, Scott has the answer.
Like when you, for instance, like you're reading identity crisis now, like let's say now, like you pick it up now, are you like sitting back with your feet up and just chilling and having a cappuccino reading it, or are you like, oh my god, look at the trauma, oh my god, look at this, oh man, that's a messed up character? Are you, or even when you watch movies, is it always like,
it has to be a little bit more intentional? So putting on a lens of having fun and just being entertained and getting immersed in the story has to be intentional. So right now I'm trying to get back into Batman comics. So I picked up the Zdarsky Batman run that I think started last summer. So I'm a few months behind. Mm-hmm. And who's the Jimenez?
Jorge Jimenez?
Yes. Yeah. And it's great. It's great. But I have to go. So comic book wise, I do go into it from the mindset of I'm 12 years old. I'm not trying to act childlike.
You're
but I'm coming in as like, I really just want to enjoy this because I love Batman comics and it's so good. I'm really, really enjoying it. You might be watching The Last of Us on HBO. So that's an example where when watching a television show that is full of psychology, I also have to kind of take an intentional switch and just make sure I'm participating in it as a fan. But it's almost like human nature to me. I will notice things, especially if there's a medical or mental health element to it. I will notice the inaccuracies right away. So I can't help but, I mean, my poor husband listens to me. Like I'll be like, pause it. That's not accurate. That's not right. Even just watching Harrison Ford is in this amazing show where he plays a therapist. And even that, which is not really based in superheroes, I'll pause it and just say like, okay, this is wrong. This is inaccurate. Therapists don't do this. Therapists don't take their clients out to games or whatever he was doing in the way that he was. So some of it has to be pretty intentional, but I can't help but just have that psychology lens and bring that in whether I want to or not.
Sure.
Okay. And now just to follow up on that, have you ever like, for instance, with, Star-Lord, for instance, in Guardians of the Galaxy with the daddy issues, and I say daddy issues with the utmost respect. So are you like, man, James Gunn he must have issues, off camera with his dad, or wow, this writer must really been in a dark place when they wrote this story for Batman 547 or something?
That is a really good question. I don't interpret the story as the writers as a key to the writer's well-being. I often actually will think of the writer as very insightful if I'm noticing those patterns. And I guess I know, being a consultant, I know that writers do a lot of research and thorough exploration of these themes, sometimes in a good direction, sometimes in a not so good direction. But I think that I have a respect for that separation between the story and the writer.
Okay.
You don't find yourself generally like taking it additional beyond to the point of the creators behind it. You'll look at the characters and you look at the psychology of the characters, but you don't then take it yet another level and see the people behind the screen, so to speak.
That's right. And I'm not saying that creators and writers don't have their own mental health issues or struggles. Many do. And many of those struggles will surface in their work.
Sure.
But I think that I just have this distance with it. I just kind of respect the process. Not being a creative writer myself, I think that I respect the process and honor that there is somewhat of a separation, a distinction between the character psychology and the creator psychology.
One of our listeners, we'll call him, his name's Lucas Q. He asked me, because I told him we were having you on, and he's familiar with you, of course. Having watched the original Batman movie with Jack Nicholson and Heath Ledger, would you have a different diagnoses for, like, Jack is, this way, or his Joker was this way, Heath's Joker was that?
That is such a great question.
Yeah.
Lucas Q, I have thought about this before, not surprisingly, and I actually wrote multiple essays on different depictions of the Jokers, ranging from Keaton's Joker, or rather Nicholson's Joker, to the animated series Joker, to Heath Ledger's Joker, to this most recent Joaquin Phoenix version of the Joker.
And that's on your website?
It's on, yeah, you can find it there. It links to that, a list of essays. But if you just Google fandom, fandom.com, fandom and my name and Joker, all of the essays will come up. And these are lengthy analyses around about each of the Joker's psychology. And to summarize all of it, I'd say that my understanding or my hypothesis with this is that each of the Jokers represented society's deepest fear. So at the time of Nicholson, there was a boom in classism. There was a lot of sort of a celebration, unfortunately, of capitalism. And so the act of going into an art museum and defacing these priceless pieces was the most horrific thing you could do. Like now, if today's Joker did something like that, we would find it just so silly. Like this is not scary to us. At the time, and it's even hard to articulate this, but I think at the time that level and version of radicalism, that extremism, was destroying and taking down capitalism. That's what kind of made that Joker a scary villain. Today's Joker is the lone gunman, the guy who's very misunderstood, mysterious, potentially has access to a weapon. This is a portrayal. I'm now thinking of Joaquin Phoenix's version. This is the version wherein society believes that a mental illness is a direct antecedent to homicidal acts and violence and extreme violence. And so I think that today's Joker is the one who's going to create or cause a mass casualty event. And that's Joaquin Phoenix's Joker. I sort of like agree that that's the scariest version, today's version, in comparison to Jack Nicholson's version. But I also have to disagree with that very exaggerated connection between mental illness and violence.
What about Heath Ledger's Joker?
Yeah.
In
So good, right?
the
Maybe that Joker's almost like a bridge. Heath Ledger's version would be a bridge between Nicholson and Joaquin, you know.
right, right. And so Heath Ledger's version of the Joker is representing anarchy.
Mhm.
So this is a figure in society who is willing to be so destructive that they almost have um, no care that they may also be destroyed in the process. So there's a chaos to it. There's a psychological chaos to it, but there's also a relational chaos to it.
Doesn't he
No,
say? Doesn't he say in that some men just want to see the world burn? Doesn't he say
that's it.
something like that?
That's what Alfred said. But he said, I'm an agent of chaos.
Okay.
Exactly, exactly. And so I think back, at the time, that was grounded in what scared Western society the most. And that was a very kind of post 9/11 fear of our democracy being taken down. Again, they all have the same kind of destructive pattern, but it's sort of like what are they targeting in their destruction? And I can't leave out my favorite Joker, Mark Hamill's Joker in the animated series. And
Ooh,
this Joker is a little different. This Joker is relationally destructive. This Joker wants to get close to Batman. This Joker seeks a very perverse and, if I can use the word, yes, insane, very perverse and maladaptive way to connect with others, wants to get close to people so that they can harm them. That's a very different Joker than the ones that I just described, but they all deserve their time and their historical place. And I'll be honest, I don't know why in the early 90s, if we were to contextualize that Joker, why that's super scary at that time. But I'm sure there's a reason.
Lucas had also asked just two more quick questions. Is there a villain of Batman's Rogues Gallery that you like that you could relate to, or
Oh,
is that
that
too
is
far?
not the question I thought. I thought Lucas Q was going to ask me who was my favorite.
Well,
Who
well,
would
he
I?
does. The last question is he does want to know who you sympathize with the most also.
Okay, I'll start there. I sympathize with all of them, of course. I think that so the villains in the Rogues Gallery who make me the most curious are the monsters. So
Face,
yeah,
Croc.
the Riddler, not so much. Joker, sure, but it's Killer Croc, it's Clayface, and to some degree, Mr. Freeze, because he's sort of become monster-esque. And fundamentally, I think that it's because there's element of um, their own origin story. So there's an element of sympathy with each of them, but a part of that is their origin story. They did not just wake up one day and decide, I'm going to do bad things and I'm going to do bad things to Batman. They were harmed. They were outcast. They were outcasts. They were excluded. They were not treated like humans. And so what is it? Is it anything but natural for them to become monsters when they're being treated like monsters? So there's something a little bit relatable there, just in that compassion we might have for them. I find those to be the most interesting villains in the gallery. In terms of who I feel like I can relate to, and the obvious answer is Harley Quinn, right? Because she depends on who writes her. Sometimes she's a clinical psychologist, sometimes she's a psychiatric intern.
I
But
thought you were going to throw a curve and say Poison Ivy. So
no, I think Harley Quinn is for me a relatable character because of her. I think the all of the hard work around becoming a professional in the field that she's in, which is the field I'm in. And then, we lose her a little bit with some of the stories where she's willing to violate and compromise her own integrity, to be in a relationship with Joker, to be villainous. But I think that's a character who I really care about because of the kind of grayness about her psychology. She can be an anti-hero. When she's in the Suicide Squad, she sometimes serves as an anti-hero, and I like that about her.
Well said. Well said. I would not have guessed her. I know like the choices are slim, but I was thinking like Harley might have been a little too for you. But
she's out there, yeah.
Right, but the way you explained it makes sense. What do you think of Margot Robbie's Harley? Because I was telling Scott when the Suicide Squad came out, and it was like Harley Quinn on screen, and the way Robbie portrayed her, it was like, whoa. It was like, yeah. So what do you think?
I loved it. I think that she really nailed it. It's just, it's hard to play that character. You have to be dynamic and lovable and charming. This is how to be a sociopath, right?
All right.
In order to be a sociopath.
Hold on. Where's my pen? No. Okay.
How to be a sociopath? You have to be charming. You have to be fascinating. You have to be extroverted, and people want to be around you. And I think that Margot really captured that. She also did, I think, a great job of portraying someone who is, not neurotypical. So her brain works a different way. She's super savvy and very sharp, and also has this self-awareness that her brain works in a different way than other people. There's a line that I really like. I think it's in the first Suicide Squad movie with Margot, where she says that she's hearing voices and then kind of makes a joke about it. Like, that's what you think. That's exactly what you think I'm going to do or say. And that self-awareness about how other people treat people with mental illness, I think is a really kind of a smart writing move for that character.
Yeah, that was spot on. That got a big reaction from me, and also in the theater I was with, because it was like, yeah, she's like, what? I should kill all these people? No, that's not what they said.
Right.
It's like this. It's like, yeah, like that's Harley to a T.
Do you prefer to consume, because you spoke of comics, or rather the cartoons, both the X-Men and the Batman being influential or something you enjoyed? If you had a preference, do you prefer doing cartoons over the comic books?
You mean as a consumer or as a podcaster?
I guess just as intake, however and whatever is your preferred method of consuming, do you find that you just kind of prefer the cartoon, the visual format better than the page?
I like this question. I think I like them both for different reasons, but picking up a physical comic book and like reading a single issue is so special.
Mm-hmm.
A part of that.
Do you smell the page?
I do. I don't.
Yes.
I do. I don't really like digital versions because of just the way to read comic books. For folks, I can't imagine anyone's listening to the show and has never opened a comic book, but the sequential art, getting nerdy a little bit, the sequential art has a certain availability of processing. So obviously, depending on which senses you use, you can read the dialogue, you can look at the sequential art. The way that I read comic books is not necessarily linear. Sometimes I'll turn the page and just gasp at the whole page, at the whole scenery. And if you're reading Jim Lee or something, you've got a lot to look at. So I think that the experience with a comic book is so special, so fundamentally dynamic and nostalgic. And yes, I smell the comic books too.
Yes.
So there's something so specific to that experience that I would not, it's its own thing. And then, of course, watching a an animated film or watching an animated series is entertaining and special in its own way. But I think that reading the comic book is probably more immersive for me. I've been to Ithaca, where
wow,
I know
We have a really
What's
awesome
happening?
Comic Con here in Albany.
No, it's like with all respect, it's a townie con. It's like, like it's a very
those are the
small.
best. Those are the
Yeah,
best.
We have a good time.
I lived in upstate New York, not near Albany, but in upstate New York when I went to college.
Okay.
And that also happened to be the time that I pretended I didn't like comics. So
Okay.
I missed out. I'm sure there were great shows and comic conventions, and it sounds like there were these local ones, and I never had the chance to go.
Well, this one's interesting. It's in the Polish Sportsman's Club. It's like in a room, like right to the side of a bar, like a small little like 80s
Those are the
retro
best.
bar. Yeah. It's like the ones my dad would take me to and sit me down and give me a comic book while he bet the horses. But anyway, I digress. So Scott and I are at this Comic-Con, and I saw, tell me if you've ever read this. It was the comic book adaptation of Batman Returns. Do you remember that?
I do not remember it.
Okay.
But it's a thing they did.
Yeah. So
He
when
was
I was a kid,
happy about it. He
yeah,
was so happy. It was like, man, you could not have given him anything better.
yeah. Because I told Scott when I was born in '82, so that movie came out, and I just turned 10. I saw the movie the second weekend with my friend. Like this was like where my friend and I were like grown-ups, sort of kind of, because our parents dropped us off at the theater and then said, call when you're done, right? One of those deals. So I remember where I grew up on Long Island, they had what was called the sidewalk sale, where all the local merchants on like the main street had all their goods on the sidewalk. There was like a band, and Mr. Softy was there with ice cream. And I remember going by this one, and I saw that, and I bought it. And I remember going home. My mom and dad had the air conditioner on and laying on the couch and reading this comic. And so when Scott and I saw the book, I had not thought of, not imagined anything. And I was like, oh, look at this. And like Scott's looking through the thing, and I had to like grab him and stop him and be like, no, look. And I, regurgitated the whole story I just said.
That's great. And those small conventions are experiences that are unlike any other experience. It's the, take away all of the flashiness of these bigger cons, and really people are there to find comic books, to connect with other collectors, to feel like they did when they were a kid. My husband speaks of Star Trek conventions this way, because when he was a kid, his dad would take him to various Star Trek conventions, and he grew up on the East Coast, where I guess there were plenty. Like every couple months there would be a Star Trek convention or event, and so something like that is just really, it's very special to the collector, to the fan, and I'm really glad that we still have those kinds of events. There's some on the West Coast as well, specifically in San Diego, the place where they have the biggest comic convention. They also have smaller events as well.
I follow the guy on Twitter, and I'll be like, hey man, you should have Drea Letamendi come, her and Brian Ward.
Oh, we'd love to.
No, I wouldn't be like, you should put him up like there's a Marriott a few miles away, or he might put you in like the local Hotel 6. I have no idea.
Oh my gosh.
They have free Wi-Fi though.
Yeah. Oh, this guy inked Captain America number 385 in 1971. You should get his autograph. It's like one of those deals. Did you marinate on it?
No.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm fully
It's not a hard
prepared
question though.
I'm going to stumble my way through my response.
Please, if you stumble, then I fall over, get up, fall over again. Okay. So what is it besides humor with Marvel movies that touches something inside of the general audience? And I include nerds, us fellow nerds in that as well, that most people seem to respond to Marvel as opposed to what seems to be a niche audience that Snyder went for his 3 movies, and that seemed to have been with the fun of DC. What is it inside, consciously or subconsciously? Why do I feel that certain way when I watch a Marvel movie? What do you say?
What are you feeling when you watch a Marvel movie?
I feel kind of like a levity, like a lightness. Like I'm just kind of there to eat popcorn, and there's some cool things that happen. I'm not I'm not I'm not a Marvel guy at all. I've barely read a Marvel comic book. I always grew up with DC. And so the Marvel movies have actually gotten me to buy a whole bunch of omnibuses to retroactively catch up on the lore. Um, so there's even I can't explain to you other like, all right, I like the story, the movie's fun, it's a good time, but there's something inside that I feel outside of just the typical, oh well, Marvel has humor and DC doesn't.
You're right. It's more than humor. I'm not sure that I fully can grasp or pinpoint what it is that's so
But
um
do you feel that?
different.
Do you understand
I
the
do.
feeling?
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a difference. And I guess that with Marvel and I'm like, look, I'm the kind of person, especially with Star Wars too, like I just like that we have it. So I
Mhm.
will not criticize or complain. I'll be there for it. So I'm just happy it's there. But yes, Marvel, I think, has been more successful in having a bigger audience relate to its storytelling. A part of that is what I think James Gunn is trying to fix or resolve, which is that there's so many connecting fibers with Marvel storytelling. They have the ability to get anyone into the movie theater, whether you've been watching these films for 10 years
10 years,
or,
but
or not,
that's gonna be our code word when we see you
10
at a
years.
Comic-Con one
You'd be
year.
like,
You're like,
10 years.
"Yeah, me, 10 years, 10 years." Be like, oh, that's right. Yeah, 10 years.
So, yeah, I mean, Marvel has this ability to have this connective tissue that gives the story enough of relational, interpersonal storytelling meat to it. It doesn't feel sloppy. And sometimes DC feels like, did you not just like, are you all writing in different, completely different, isolated um, frameworks? Like, how does this all fit together? Some people don't care that it doesn't fit together, but I think because Marvel has done it so well and made us believe that this universe exists or these multiple universes exist, that is just so much more successful than the clumsiness of DC storytelling, which is which can be very entertaining and full of explosions and full of villains, but doesn't really seem to have that long-lasting takeaway that this universe actually exists. And the problem I have with that, for me, fundamentally, is that those of us who care about comic book storytelling want to feel that connection. And we felt that connection when we were picking up comics as a kid. And I can go to my store and pick up a Batman comic today by Zdarsky and feel like there's something in there, and there was, that related to the comics that I read 10 years ago. So, DC can do it in the comics, but somehow they're not translating that to their cinematic universe. And I think they know this.
What
That's
about the
interesting.
heaviness? Like the
But
heaviness where people were like, oh man, Batman v Superman was so dark and so and Snyder's Justice League is so different than the, Diet Avengers that Whedon came across.
yeah, I think I don't know if this I missed the first part of what you were saying.
Oh,
Maybe say it again.
sure. Thank you. The tone, like people find like Marvel is like eating a slice of pizza, whereas DC with like Batman versus Superman is like trying to get your mouth around like a chicken parm hero. You know what I mean?
No.
Okay.
Those are foods that I have no understanding of how they taste. But culturally, yes. I mean, I think maybe food is a good example of like all the ingredients should work together. And DC is sort of like, but we're
It's
saying this is a taco, so you should
right, Marvel, because I find Marvel to just be like you said, anybody can go, it's easily digestible. Whereas, for instance, with Batman v Superman, I saw the original theatrical cut when it came out, was super jazzed to watch it, didn't like it. And I was really disappointed in myself that I didn't like it. I'm like, well, maybe I'm missing something. So I watched the Ultimate Edition when it came out, and I enjoyed that better. But since then, I don't know if you've heard this podcast. There's Batman versus Superman by the minute. So you can find it on Apple the same way you find your fantastic podcast. And they right now they're up to like I think a minute 182 or 83. And these guys break the movie down and the layers of the movie and what is the story telling you besides what your eye is seeing. Like it's all this subterfuge, like this subconscious barrage of information. And when I watch the movie now, having listened to this, I
It's colored
appreciate
your view.
so much more.
Mm.
But then I'm like, maybe they just outsmarted themselves when they made the movie.
I will say that the Snyder cut of the Justice League movie was better than, just in my opinion, of what
No,
we
go
had.
ahead. It's mine too. Go ahead.
Same here.
Clearly, I'm very careful in how I word this because this is a very dynamic fandom. But what I will say is I'd rather watch 6 hours of a story that has heart to it than a couple hours of something that just seemed really fragmented and thrown together.
The theatrical release was terrible. It didn't make sense. I came into it again blind, not knowing much, and we were preparing for to interview Sean O'Connell and talk to him in regards to the context of his book that talks about this. And I was like, wow, these movies are bad. These theatrical release movies are just really, really bad. And then, so Brian had me watch the originals, if you will, or the theatrical releases. And then he's like, okay, now watch the recuts. And it was like a totally different movie. And it made so much more sense. And it's like, I can't believe that they got released in the format that they did. It's just wild. It's a really interesting thing. It's interesting. I think you hit on something really strong in the answer to that last question, as far as the connection of one of the things that's crucial in the experience of reading the paper editions of the comics is that bigger world, and knowing that there are interconnections. And you'd read Marvel and it's like, oh, and there'd be a little asterisk and it's like, oh well, that happened in issue number 134 of X-Men, that kind of stuff. And Marvel did a good job of capturing that. And I never really thought of it consciously, but I think is kind of important. And one of the reasons that their execution worked so well is that even if you weren't consciously aware that that's kind of important to you in the background of the experience, you kind of expected it. It should be there. And if it's not, if that interconnectivity wasn't there, and like you're saying, it's just like dropping kind of semi-random things that happen to have this character or that character, kind of really loses what you expect a comic experience to be, whether it's in film or in paper.
Well said. There's something self-aware about those notes to the reader, to the consumer, to the audience. Like, I know you're there and I care. It's like the creator or writers are saying, I care that you get this. Like, I don't want you to feel kind of adrift or lost, or even still, like, I think comics can be intimidating. Where do we start? Everything's always recycled and redone and re-envisioned, and it's confusing. And why are there multiple universes? And it can be, I think, it can feel very excluding for people. But those moments that, especially with the films that welcome people into the storytelling, which Marvel does so well, is something that I think DC in its cinematic universe needs to work on. That sense of belongingness as an audience member is really, really critical. And I really, I guess, am fundamentally disappointed in creators who don't realize that we are not just passively watching or reading. We are belonging. We yearn to belong to these universes or to these worlds. Mm-hmm. And so, how do they create that sense of connectivity for us? And the comics, historically, that they just do this so well, and it's missing in some of the film adaptations. And the last thing I'll say about DC for now is that the DC animated films, like now going full circle to where we started with this conversation, the DC animated films tend to do well with this connection to the audience. And I think it's because they really rely on the source material. They really understand the fandom. They are, there's a humility to the animated films. I love them so much. And my plug for the show is that there is a Batman animated film. I think it's going to be called The Doom That Came to Gotham.
Yes.
And there's going to be some bonus features that y'all should check out.
You just opened my mind because, yeah, Marvel makes it more like a comic book. Like you're reading, I picked up Avengers, #1, and now I'm reading Spider-Man Homecoming #1, and then this, but it's all part of like the same event. So I think that's what it is. I think you just answered my question more because I couldn't answer it within myself other than what am I feeling? What am I thinking?
You're
I think
so
it's
welcome.
interesting what you said about the animated films too, because Perch, I don't know if you ever listened to his podcast, Comics by Perch. He just dropped an episode where it was after the James Gunn most recent announcements or the phase 1 announcements or whatever they're calling it. And his takeaway, he said, you know what, DC, forget about the live action stuff. Just forget about it. You have leadership in the animated, which you're threatening to throw away if you don't execute on it. Play to your strengths. Do the animated thing and own that space, because you're always going to end up being a Me Too in comparison to Marvel, or a secondary, because Marvel's just owned that space. It's just theirs now. And you're always going to be framed from that lens. And how are you going to beat it? So I thought that was an interesting thought.
It is. It's pretty accurate. As we get hopeful about this upcoming new era for DC, their efforts plainly articulated to connect the cinematic universe to the television shows, to the games, it's audacious what they're coming up with. But, again, I'm here for it. I will be first in line. I really don't come from a place of criticism. I come from a place of curiosity, and I'm excited for it. And I'm really interested to learn how this is all going to work out. I think that the off-ramp to the Elseworld one-offs or singular stories like Matt Reeves' Batman and Teen Titans Go and all that, like, I think that's going to be the constant excuse when things really don't connect. But I'm fine with that. I think the one-offs actually are pretty successful. The Joker film doesn't need to connect to all the other worlds or all the other plot lines. It on its own was really powerful.
And sometimes it's tiresome. I'm totally spent on Marvel at this point, honestly. I mean, I'm looking forward to seeing the new Ant-Man film because I like those characters, but I don't really care about all the bigger story.
I wasn't going to mention this, Drea, but you mentioned the Batman. Actually, it wasn't even on my mind, but you mentioned it, and being your profession. Can we talk about Scott shedding like 2 tears while we watch the Batman? Can we get a diagnosis on this?
When was that? What part?
It wasn't, I don't even remember what part it was at this point. Do you remember, Brian?
I remember it being toward the ending of the movie and when he and Catwoman were overlooking the city. I think it was sunrise. And Scott and I went and saw it in IMAX. We saw it twice, but this was
the second time.
It was the
second
time.
It's so, I just felt like that film was so well executed. And when I see work that's so good, it just kind of makes me emotional. So it wasn't about the story per se. It was about the execution of, man, this is such a good movie. And I just, it really hits me at times.
So I'm trying to be like your husband and stir the pot a little bit there. But...
I fully embrace the dialogue and the dissection and debate about Matt Reeves' Batman. I definitely appreciated this portrayal, this version of Batman, these early days where he doesn't quite have it together. He's very fallible. He's very broody. And there's also a loneliness to it that isn't just contained within Bruce Wayne. Everybody has kind of this sadness to them. Everybody's trying to survive in Gotham City. and it's a gritty story, and it's not for everybody. But
Yeah.
I sort of feel like that's a version of Batman that I can kind of characterize as like my Batman, even though that's a weird thing to say. Like that's a depiction that's very like, oh, that I know this guy. That's my Batman.
Yeah, agreed.
When
I do really like that movie.
when you saw it, did you have to see it multiple times to appreciate it? Because when I first saw it, I'm like, I just couldn't get the Nolan out of my mind, the comparison as I'm watching the movie. And then the second time I was able to distance myself, watch it and be like, wow, this is a beautiful movie, beautifully shot, excellent story. When people ask me about the movie, I'm like, it's like a comic book, a gritty noir comic book that I've read come to life. It's not like a Batman movie.
I felt a huge connection there to the comics. And honestly, within the first 10 minutes, I was like, Christian Bale, who's that? What?
Heresy.
No,
Heresy.
I know.
I
So
have a man
yeah,
crush
this
on
is
Christian.
I'm
Christian Bale was a
the
really
same
good
way as
Batman.
you. I was like, I don't care if I see Chris Nolan Batman again after that one. That's just me. And it's not that those movies are bad. They just never resonated that strongly with me. So I enjoy this one.
My favorite Batman movie is Batman Returns.
Wow. Wow. There's a lot of psychology going on in that movie. Is that why, or
I think there's a nostalgic element to it.
Okay.
You know,
Sure, I understand.
but you know, I love monsters, lots of monster psychology, people not fitting in, misfits, everybody's miserable. I mean, it's so goth.
Everybody's
It's so
miserable.
goth.
Yeah.
Like I was sort of a Gen X goth girl, so this is a good Batman movie.
Yeah, I told Scott about your xenomorph thing, so I was like,
Oh
yeah.
yes.
So when you say monsters, now it's like ding ding, they connect. So yeah.
So did you have a crush on Christopher Walken when you saw
Weird.
Batman Returns?
I know, weird, but kind of, yeah, a little bit. I mean, gosh, Michelle Pfeiffer just nails
She was chewing
Catwoman.
she was eating the scenery.
And Danny DeVito makes a really super creepy
Danny
penguin.
DeVito was just chewing it. He was just chewing it.
So good.
Yeah. And
So
Christopher
good.
Walken, who can't get enough of him. So I'll push her out a higher window next time, he told his son. That's always a good thing.
And then the cats just lick her blood up. Like it's just so ghastly and gothic. Like it's good. I mean, I think you have to be willing to entertain this like really dark motif. It's a mood. And if you're coming into it from today's like, you know, critical eye of superhero films, you're just going to be like, what the F is this? This is like, you know, really perverse. So it's, you know, I will fight anybody who says that that's not a good Batman movie. I really, really like it a lot.
All right. My very last question for you, and thank you so much again, is favorite Kevin Conroy memory at a con.
Okay. I haven't actually not answered this question before.
All right.
Years ago, 10 years ago, not 10 years ago, but a few years ago, the Arkham Sessions presented at a convention. I want to say it was WonderCon in Anaheim. I'm not exactly sure, but it was before the pandemic. We had a panel scheduled, and right before the panel, we got in line to see Kevin and get one of those, you know, signature fan pictures with him and get our picture signed, all of that, the whole thing. And Brian and I met him briefly, of course, because they have to kind of move through this pretty quickly. We were so close. We only had a few more minutes left, and we worried if we needed to get out of the line, miss our chance to meet him to get to this panel that we were presenting on. And luckily things moved forward and we got to meet him, and he was very, very kind and gentle and very lovely. There was something kind of subdued, like he's not over the top. He's not doing voices with you. He's just a very kind person. And I didn't meet him after that. That was the only time that I met him. We had entertained bringing him on to a panel or trying to work with him in some way, but that never worked out. We had Lauren Lester on our panel and other folks. We've had Paul Dini on our panel, but we've never had Kevin. So it was a memory that is just very special. And it's one of those, or he is one of those people who represents, the reason that I even got into the comics and the Batman world, honestly. And I say this with a complete straight face. I do not think I would have this career if it weren't for the compassionate work that he did voicing Batman in a way that brought me into that imagination. I honestly feel this way. I owe a lot to him, and I think he raised a lot of us.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. I met him in 2014, I think it was, New York City Comic Con. 2014, yes. And I remember standing in line, and it just seemed like it went on forever. I was there. I stood in line for literally 2 hours. I was so hungry. And I remember thinking to myself, I think I'm going to jump out the line, but I stayed. And I was very curious, a curious excitement. But once I met Kevin face to face, he was sitting down and he shook my hand, looked me in the eye, smiled, was vibrant. I was overcome. I was overcome with just this boyhood excitement. And I'm meeting Batman,
Yeah.
And I remember I told him, because I was shocked, because he was so nice to everyone leading up to me and then to me. Whereas I couldn't imagine having the tolerance for that all day without drinking or being medicated sincerely. And he treated me like he must have treated the first person. And I remember he came out from behind the table. He took a picture with me. He put his arm around me over my shoulder. I took mine and had it over his, black polo with the red. And I just had this fist pump, and I was like, yeah, like this in the picture. And it's one of the most priceless, precious moments of my entire life.
That's amazing. I don't know that he truly understands how much he means to us, but then when I hear stories like that, I'm like, maybe he does. Maybe deep down he really gets it. And those interactions, they're just so priceless.
Thank you for being kinder in person than you sound on your podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for spending the time with me and creating a space that just kind of feels like we're at we're having lunch at a comic convention and just chatting about the things that we love. Well, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Scott, for having me on.
Thank you. Tell Brian that Rogue One is my favorite Star Wars film.
I will. He'll enjoy that. And to folks listening, you can find it drdreapsychology.com. I'm pretty active on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc. But we just opened our Discord not too long ago. We had it open to our patrons for a little bit, and now it's completely open. And I just want to invite people to check it out. It's not just about the animated series. It's not just about Batman, and it's also not just about psychology. It's really kind of a fun place for people to talk about movies they're watching and what they're doing to take care of themselves and what comics they're into. And I invite you both, please, to join us and be a part of the conversation. Please, you can also share your show, and I invite listeners to also check it out. I'm posting in there once in a while too, and sometimes I'll put something in there that I might not put in other spaces. So
what's the name of the server, Drea?
Really good question. So it's the Arkham Sessions Discord, but I think that you need a link for it. So the way that we've been sharing the link is on Twitter, on
do you want to email
Instagram.
it to me, and I'll
we'll do that. I'll send you an email and it'll have the link to it. I'm still learning about Discord. It's really, really fun, but I know nothing,
so this will be cool.
Oh, fun. Thank you so much for having me. Have a good night.
Good night. Hey, hit that like button and subscribe.
Sheehan, that's one for you.